developing functional biogeography across the tropics. So Jackie, we see your screen and you can
Okay.
kick it off.
Great, thanks. So thank you, Charlie and Will. My name is Jackie Schumann, and yeah, I'll be talking about simulations looking at how fire contributes to capturing biogeography across the tropics. Gets me every time. Here we go. So globally, we're seeing increases in fire danger. The figure on the left, thank you, Yui, for showing me the update to this figure from Matt Jolly. We're seeing longer fire seasons. The areas in dark brown indicate lengthening fire seasons, and we expect these fire seasons to continue getting worse. And so the figures on the right show you colors in red that indicate extreme fire risk continuing in the future. And so if we look here at the Western United States, we see that drier conditions are associated with larger fire. So in the map, we have a measure of VPD. The deep reds indicate dry conditions. So a lot of these areas are in extreme drying. This is from last year. I need to update this. But then if you look at the figure on the right, this is the map associated with the figure on the right. And you can see that as you increase in drying, you also increase in fire size. A more recent analysis showed that this high VPD for a subset of the Mountain West, again, shown here as the black line now, is associated with increased burning. But that increase in burning is unprecedented compared to the last 2 millennia. And the fire season from 2020 in particular marks a new fire regime. And so we've transitioned to just fire activity that we haven't seen. And so why does this matter? If we take a step back and think about this globally, you have different fire regimes around the world depending on the climate and the vegetation. The vegetation acts as fuels. This is a map classifying fires based on sort of the behavior of the fire and the type of vegetation. As we're thinking about transitioning into unprecedented fire activity, we need to think about how these changing fuels have the capacity to impact fire behavior. And so to do that, we really need a model that is going to be interactive with the climate and then interactive with fuels. And so those fuels change, that vegetation changes, and then changes fire behavior. And then we need fire to really impact the vegetation and alter vegetation recovery. So I've been looking at this with Spitfire in the FATES model. FATES is the functionally assembled terrestrial ecosystem simulator. It's a module that runs inside a host land model. I use it within CLM, and it replaces the traditional big leaf vegetation, so our traditional box of carbon, with size structured vegetation. And so we have different types of vegetation, different heights, different sizes, and so we get more realistic dynamics for that vegetation. The important thing about FATES is that we have variability. And so on a particular grid cell, you can have multiple patches that have different times sense disturbance. And so the vegetation on those patches is going to have a different size structure, different characteristics, and these characteristics translate to different fire behaviors, different fire vulnerabilities. Vegetation mortality due to fire varies for trees versus grasses. Trees are protected depending on the vegetation type and their height. And so as trees grow taller, they accumulate more bark. That bark affords them some protection from the heat of the flames coming through. As trees grow taller, they accumulate more height. Their canopy has the capacity to grow beyond the flames, thereby avoiding canopy damage. Grasses are not protected from fire. Anytime you have a fire, the grasses will burn. After a fire comes through, we retain some of that affected vegetation. And so the fire behavior the next day would be very different than the day before because you have a different fuel structure. So the testing that I'm doing is really looking at fire strategies. I have a fire vulnerable tree with a large canopy and thin bark, a fire tolerant tree with a thinner canopy and thick bark, and then I have C4 grasses. And so I'm looking at how these vegetation traits interact with climate and fire disturbance to govern ecosystem assembly. And so this is really motivated by real world observations of how trees look. And so the map on the right shows you observations of bark thickness for different trees. And if we look at South America in particular, you can see that we have an area shown here in blue indicating trees with thin bark, contrasting to an area shown here in red of trees with much thicker bark. And so if we look at the picture on the left, this labeled C, these are pictures of trees with thick bark. And this picture labeled C, you can see the inside of the stem, and then surrounding that, you have this darker bark with excessive amount of bark. And so as the flames come through, that bark provides a blanket where the internal water and storage capacity of the tree is not affected. And so the tree doesn't take any damage, or it's less likely to take damage. And so why are we interested in this? These areas where we have thin bark trees correspond to the Amazon, which corresponds to very high biomass forests. These high biomass forests occur here through the interaction of climate, fire, and vegetation state. And so a change in the climate or the fire regime has the capacity to alter the types of vegetation and therefore these large carbon stores. And so I'll be showing you results at the end of 300-year simulations. I have a set of half-degree runs for South America, and then 1-degree runs for across the tropics. And I have 3 types of vegetation that are competing, a vulnerable thin bark tree, a fire-adapted thick bark tree, and then C4 grasses. And so if we look tropically, we have fate simulations on the top and then observations below. And so in terms of productivity, we have reasonable productivity. If we look at GPP on the left, LAI on the right, we have high LAI compared to observations. If we look specifically at biomass, we have fate simulated biomass on the top, and then observations from Sasan Sachi on the bottom. What we see is that, and so these are highly productive forests, but we have variable biomass accumulation across these regions. And so the broad spatial pattern does correspond to what we see in observations. However, we have areas that have high biomass accumulation. These simulations do not include land cover land use change. So we have areas that are cleared in the observations. If you look in particular at South America, you can see these Atlantic forests are growing strong, whereas in reality, they've been cleared for agriculture. If we look more specifically at South America, you can see that we have broad coverage of trees, but then when you look at the biomass of these trees, there is variable accumulation. And so there's an interaction of disturbance here, which I'll show on the next slide. In parts of the Amazon that have this more moderate biomass accumulation, we do see values that are closer to observations. And if we look at the patterns of burning in that area, and so in the middle, we have fate's simulated burned fraction, and then on the right, we have observed burned fraction. And what we can see is that the areas with moderate biomass accumulation in the model correspond to areas that have consistent disturbance. It's important to note that we have an excessive amount of burning in parts of the Amazon compared to what we see in observations. These are very low intensity fires, but we definitely have a large amount of burning. And then we have this area shown here in dark black, which indicates repeat burns. And those are not present in the observations. If we take a step back and look at the tropical picture, you can see that this overprediction or these repeat burns are present across Africa and other continents. And so overall, the model is burning more than what we see in observations. There is a connection with this burning though. And so the areas that we have repeat burning is associated with areas where we have grass dominance. If you recall, I said that whenever you have a fire, grasses are going to burn. And so the grasses are very available to burning. And so it's sort of a self-repeating cycle here. But I need to look into this more. But if we think about this, the biomass accumulation that we have and the fire disturbance patterns that we have are interacting together to give us a dynamic vegetation model that produces biomass and vegetation distributions that don't look terrible. They're actually quite reasonable considering that everything is emergent from the model. If we look specifically at how this fire disturbance shapes forest structure, we can see that the distribution of thin bark trees versus thick bark trees broadly corresponds to what we see in observations, with the thin bark trees existing in the Amazon and the thick bark trees in the western portion, in the eastern portions. And so we're getting this dynamic assembly through the interaction of climate, disturbance, and vegetation traits. Is this mechanism due to fire mortality? If we look at fire mortality for the thin bark tree on the top and the thick bark tree below, we can see that the small trees are all vulnerable to fire mortality, shown here as darker colors. But as the trees get taller, they escape fire mortality with height and bark characteristics. But you can see that the thin bark tree is still vulnerable even at these larger size classes. It's important to note the connection between aridity and the fuels. The results that I've been showing you represent this middle row, which is a moderate amount of fuel drying. If we look at a condition where we have drier fuels, you can see that with drier fuels, we get more burning. With more burning, we get more grass. And then with more burning, we get an encroachment of the thick bark tree into the range of the thin bark tree. Contrasting that, if we have less fuel drying, we lose our grasses, and then the thin bark tree is more competitive. If we compare this to a simulation without fire, the thin bark tree, which requires less resources to grow and compete, becomes dominant across all of South America. And so this suggests, and I acknowledge that there are other mortality mechanisms at play here, but we can see that the fire mechanism is definitely an important component in governing this distribution of thin bark trees versus thick bark trees.
Jackie, you're at 12 minutes.
And I'm done. And so with that, I will say thank you, and I will take any questions. Or I don't know if we even have time for questions. I can't remember.
We have time for questions. That's great. Thank you, Jackie. Yeah, questions from anybody? Ryan, I see your hand up.
Hey, Jackie, great talk. I know in your previous runs that I don't think you had land use, particularly in places like the Atlantic forest. I was just curious if that's true in these runs, and I know it explains a lot of the bias differences we see with like biomass data sets. I'm not sure if you mentioned it early on, I just missed it.
Oh, yes, these runs also do not include land cover land use change.
Right. So if you factor that in, you know, I feel like your projections are even closer to what we'd see in those biomaps. So
yes, and we're actively working to bring land cover land use change into FATES, and so it's definitely on the planning horizon. Thanks, Ryan.
Will, I see you got your hand up.
Yeah, Jackie, it's super cool to see how far you've come with this, and I'm curious what do you see being a next step, or like the thing, like the needling thing that's hard to get right, or that you want to be able to work on, or that's maybe not a fire issue but something else with FATES that you feel like people could kind of help contribute to here?
Sure. Well, I mean, the incorporation of land cover land use change is an essential component of moving forward, and so testing that, getting that up and running is important. Thinking about the connection between fuels and climate is a piece that needs more testing within the fire components. I have some, ideas and plans there. And then just the importance of grasses and the responsiveness of grasses. So there are a lot of opportunities.
Thanks.
Dave? Or actually, David,
my question is pretty similar to Will. So
okay, Rahul.
great talk, ma'am. There is just a concern that is there fire activity more dominantly seen in the areas of high mountain areas, particularly in Himalayas and similarly in the Africa and the western coast of the US? Does it has to do anything with the fuel at the higher elevation, the conifers or something, boreal forest or something?
This testing has been focused on the tropics. I have not been doing testing in the Western United States, but there is a group that is, and Polly Biot will be presenting on that. I can't remember if that's today or tomorrow. I think it's today. And so she'll probably talk about that. Charlie Coven has also been doing testing in California. The testing that I am doing some testing of fire in the boreal, but it's in an area that's incredibly flat. So and I have not looked at the relationship between topography and fire, and it is an important component driving fire behavior and variability.
Thanks, Peter. Last question.
I was just going to quickly say, Jackie, perhaps we could post-process what that land use might look like, so you get a better look at like what would happen. So if we took the CLM agricultural areas, and I know wood halves is not going to be representative, but like we could at least do that component. That might help out a lot in terms of like seeing whether the natural vegetation components with the fire look more like the observations. But we can talk about that later.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thanks, Peter. Thank you. Okay, sorry, I should have stopped sharing.
Thanks, Jackie. So up next is Joshua Rady. Joshua, are you able to share your screen? Joshua messaged me before.
Yeah, just 1 second. Something has started. I just restarted my computer, and now all of a sudden something is auto playing on it. So just give me 1 second, please.
Okay.
The trees around the park has fallen by almost half. Clearing forests increases carbon dioxide levels.
Maybe in the meantime, I'll ask Jackie another question, which is, so the nature of the trade-off that you set up was based on the thinness of the crown. I guess could you just talk a little bit more about that trade-off?
Sure. And so within the tropics, savanna trees are adapted to have very thin crowns and then leaves that are resistant to burning. And so they just have a different makeup. And Joshua, go ahead and share your screen and I'll just stop talking when you're ready to go. And so this thin crown, they're generally shorter trees, but they do have a thinner crown. So as fires come through, they theoretically aren't going to be damaging that canopy. But then the moist tropical trees have just a much larger crown. And so they're more vulnerable to flames coming through.
Great, thanks. Okay, thanks, Jackie. Joshua, looks like you're now sharing. So
thank you. Yeah. This year, computer problems. Last year, they were cutting down trees in my front yard. So always a problem at the Land Model Working Group meeting. So hello, and thank you for having me, everybody. My name is Joshua Rady. I'm a PhD candidate at the University, Virginia Tech in Blacksburg in the Quinn Thomas Lab. And today I'm going to talk about some experiments I've been doing in the southeastern US, looking at forest management under climate change. So these are questions that I've sort of been asking through my work over the last several years, which is how will managed forests change under climate change? And something which has been harder to address is how will climate change alter forest management, which is something I've been sort of working up for several years and finally have a little bit of an answer to that in this work. So in order to examine this sort of interaction between management and climate change, I performed a regional simulation for the southeastern United States using CLM Fates with the vegetation management module added in. And important to know for these simulations, only the managed portion of the landscape is being simulated. So if you imagine that in each location, there's not natural vegetation, I'm not simulating urban areas. I'm only simulating the vegetation and the portion of it which is actually being managed by just basically having a stand at each location that is loblolly pine, at least at the time of simulation. Starts off as a full complement of PFTs, but transition it to loblolly pine. The management scenarios that I'm going to use is first a biomass short rotation management scenario, which is based on the literature and early trials for some of these systems, because quite frankly, even though biomass is something which is people talk about a lot, it's not actually being used very much. And so I basically went to the literature and found conditions that people have used or recommended, and those involved planting at a high density, growing for 10 years, and then harvesting all the above ground biomass. And then that would go to bioenergy applications, generally speaking. The second scenario, which is a clear-cut rotation scenario, this is a realistic scenario, and I base this on the way that management is actually done after doing a comprehensive survey of real-world management practices for loblolly pine management in the Southeast. It uses a typical modern planting density. There's a thinning at the middle of the rotation, or maybe one or more. The harvest occurs when the stand reaches a commercial timber size. And that time, in practice varies. And I use the vegetation management module to determine when management application occurs. So that there's sort of a little silicon forester in there, so that the time, that's important, the timing of events, planting, harvest, thinning, are all determined by the software. I don't determine those in advance. Here's some example output from a subregion, just a piece of the Southeastern United States from that map I showed you above. This has 6 grid cells in the Mid-Atlantic region for one of our SSPs. And I just wanted you to see what the data looks like. You get these classic sort of sawtooth pattern plots. If you want to take a look, you can see you can see the full rotations. You can also see there's a little, in the middle, we have thinnings in these, and replantings in between after the clear cuts. And note that the patterns are similar but not identical. They're very similar because they're pretty close to each other. The variation will be greater if you look across larger parts of the region. But you can see it where I've pointed out, in some places you're getting 2 thinnings rather than just 1. And sometimes you're also getting harvest at different times based on the growth conditions in those particular grid cells. So let's look at the data overall. I'm going to show you a bunch of plots with some dots representing different aspects of the rotations, different properties. So the first thing to say is that in the clear-cut rotation scenarios, the amount of yield of wood from the rotations remains pretty much constant over time. It doesn't change between scenarios. And at the bottom, I have just 2 representative plots from a given grid cell, same grid cell, different scenarios. But the thing that does change is the rotation length decreases under SSP RCP 8.5. So under climate warming, we get a dramatic decrease in the length of time that it takes for rotation to occur, which you can see in the plot above. Those lines are just to help. I wasn't sure how well these would present because there's so many dots on top of each other. Those are not just trend lines, not fits. And in the bottom, you can also see, if you look as you go to the right with the red SSP 5 RCP 8.5, you can see that those rotations get a lot thinner, a lot quicker. And in fact, they're getting like 10 years quicker. I don't even know if this is really possible. Maybe it is. There are locations where loblolly is grown, like South America, where the rotation is almost 10 years shorter than it is in the Southeast, and in Hawaii, or it can be even shorter. So maybe this is possible, maybe not, but it's what the model is showing us. Having more rotations means you have a greater total yield. So since the harvests are occurring at different times based on when the trees are ready, you have more wood coming out, and you see a greater accumulation of wood harvest over the 21st century in the faster warming scenario. But and the product classes should be pretty much the same. So just the fact that we're cutting early doesn't mean we're changing what we're getting out, because we're waiting for the trees to be appropriate size so that the product coming out will have the same model decay rate as well. I also mentioned that thinning also decreases, so there's a decreased frequency of second thinnings. In the biomass rotation, the yield does respond to climate. So in this scenario, you have fixed rotation length, 10 years. but growth rates increase with climate change. So that by the time you get to 10 years, you're harvesting more biomass, at least in the RCP 8.5 scenario. RCP 2.6 sees a small increase during the center of the middle of the century, and then decreases back a little bit. Total above ground biomass is removed in this management scenario, which is important to remember, so that we're removing everything above the ground level. And let's see here. And larger trees at harvest means greater total yield. So in the same, we have the same effect where the SSP 5 is showing an increase over SSP 1, but for different reasons. Then if we compare these different scenarios, and I apologize, it looks like some of this, my image is getting smooth slightly. PowerPoint likes to do that. For both the scenarios, the harvest yields increase greatly when you go from SSP 1, RCP 2.6 to RCP 8.5. The biomass management scenario produces much larger yield per unit area than the clear-cut scenario. But the scenario product classes are different in use and return time, so that those removing biomass that is going to be then returned to the atmosphere on a much quicker basis may have very different implications than having wood products that have longer longevity. And I did not do a total for this because frankly, I have not, these results are very new, and I have not yet cropped out areas where these trees shouldn't be growing. So that right now, basically I plotted the whole region, and there's areas in here where these trees are not cultivated or where they wouldn't even grow if they were planted. The model is not quite so particular, so it puts grows in there everywhere, at least for a short amount of time. You can see that there are places in the top panels where there are blank grid cells, and those are places where the trees don't last very long. Those places are also locations, and some of those locations, or most of those locations, are places where I've also noted instability in the vegetation makeup during the spin-up process. So, implications. There are, management decisions have implications for our simulated outputs. And, climate is affecting growth in the real world and in the model. In the real world, that affects management, and we can implement that in the model, as I've done with the vegetation management module. Those management decisions affect the product yields and also the product classes. Those affect what mitigation and land cover change, which themselves feed back on climate. So I think that I still have work to do on this, but I think it's interesting. I think that some of these results are a bit sort of what you might expect they would be, but it's good to actually see them for the first time after several years of working to the point where I had the capacity to actually do the simulations. So in terms of future work, there's still work. These simulations have just finished in the last week. So I need to examine the impacts on total ecosystem carbon. The spin-ups that for this particular set of runs were not fully equilibrated for the soil. I have a set which should be better off, and I'm going to repeat these simulations with some modifications to try to start looking at the broader common implications of and stocks in the system. I need to investigate regional patterns more closely because the yields do not really reflect the geographic examples of what we know. We know that like some of the areas where things are growing best in the model are some of the best areas where things grow, but then there's areas that are sort of comparable or as good as them that aren't growing out as well. Like the South in the Gulf region, for example. And then I have another upcoming project to look at the land use and the implications of the way we represent the wood product fates in the model and whether there's any needs to make changes in that regard. Charlie, you're back on the screen. I don't know how many minutes I have, but I think I'm.
I think now would be a good time to switch to questions.
Yes. Sure.
Awesome. Thank you, Joshua. Questions? Peter, I see you've got your hand up.
Thanks,
Yes,
Joshua.
Peter.
Yeah, hi, Joshua. That's great. Just seeing that was really, really interesting. I'm wondering, in big leaf model, when we see CO2 fertilization of like undisturbed forests, they just keep accumulating carbon. I'm wondering, does fates do the same sort of thing? So like after, you're doing this harvest at a certain period of time or at a certain sort of biomass, but do you think that like under CO2 fertilization, fates forests are going to just keep accumulating carbon, or they're going to basically find some maximum level of carbon, which they're going to find as their climax amount of carbon? That seems to be something that we just don't do in this big leaf sort of version. We just keep on building up these thicker and thicker trunks.
I haven't run simulations long enough to know with absolute certainty, but I do see, in the simulations I have run, I see the biomass beginning to stabilize. What I need to say is that the PFTs that I'm using, the PFTs that we have as defaults are not really working realistically. I know that, and there are people who are in the fates community who are working on that, like Jennifer Holm. And I'm sure at some point these are going to be shared with the rest of the community. But right now, I'm not able to grow a composition that's stable without species that should be present going extinct, and some of the species that remain are overpresent on the landscape. So I think I don't have enough information about what fates is going to do in the long term.
Yeah, thanks. That sounds great.
Yeah, but important question.
Thanks. Any more questions? Jackie.
I was going to type this in, but so with the difference there's such a dramatic difference between the clear cut scenario and the managed scenario. Do you think survivorship is an important component on this, or do you think it's just a delay to accumulation?
The difference between the biomass and the clear-cut scenario, I think, is mainly driven by the fact that we're harvesting trees during right after, like when they're still in their fastest growing phase. You're basically letting them grow to the point at which they're just beginning to, the canopy hasn't necessarily been closed yet. So that you're sort of just utilizing that quick early, that in the natural system would be a successional phase. And, the idea is the question is whether that's actually sustainable. In the model, I'm running this without there's no nutrient controls. So some of this, I guess it's actually probably more realistic in the case of the biomass, in that those systems always assume high management levels, including fertilization. And there's been a lot of economic analysis to make sure that that's would work, and it does, at least in large parts of the region. But I'm not sure about necessarily whether we would see these decreasing rotation lengths indefinitely, both for physiological reasons, but also because of nutrient limitations and potentially water limitations, which the model is not, I'm not really dealing with right now because I'm not running hydro. I'm not running I would like to start doing nutrients soon, but I need to talk to Ryan about how to do that properly. These were challenging, complicated simulations to set up in the current form, but they're not perfect.
Great. Thank you very much, Joshua. Next up, we've got Katie Mirrenfield from Boise State. Katie, can you share your screen? It looks like
All right.
possibly
Can everybody see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Wonderful. And I will turn off my video because my internet really hates when I have Zoom on with my video. So just to say hi, but I'm Katie Mirrenfield, and I am a graduate. I'm a PhD candidate at Boise State University, and I will be kind of piggybacking off of Joshua's work because I've used his vegetation management driver to do these simulations, and I have been using fates to test out some theories I have about how delays to forest management in the Western US can impact forests long term. So I'm hoping that through this talk, I will convince you that including more detailed management is important. And just as a warning, this is very much a super condensed version of the first 2 chapters of my dissertation I'm defending soon. So I'm going to start out with big research questions and objectives to get some practice talking about those. But I'm interested in some of the social aspects of forested ecosystems. And so I've been looking at what aspects of human systems potentially influence delays in forest management implementation. And that is because I want to think about more ways to realistically represent land management in land surface models. And then how do those models suggest forest structure and productivity respond to these different forest management practices? So there's 2 parts to this presentation. Part 1, I spent some time thinking about forest management timing and quantifying it. And just as a side note, I am mostly focused on forests in the Western US. So the objectives in management in these public lands is a little different than the management of timber plantations like Joshua was talking about in his presentation. But okay, so thinking about the timing of forest management, there's been a lot of studies that have been done thinking about how the US Forest Service has to go from planning and scoping to actual project implementation. And the biggest thing in the US is that any project that will potentially impact the land surface falls under the National Environmental Policy Act, and there are extra steps and analyses and assessments that have to be made before moving from planning and scoping to actual project implementation. And then, of course, since they are public lands, the decisions can be challenged, and that can add more time. So that's been well studied. I'm very interested in the project implementation part. And so within projects that the Forest Service conducts in Western forests in the US, there are many activities that make up a project. So just as Joshua had harvest and thinnings, that's exactly what happens in the Forest Service as well. And one thing that I've been very interested in is this idea of a project delay. And so I define a project delay in a very specific way. So again, within projects, there are multiple activities, and the Forest Service actually puts in their databases the date that these activities were planned to be completed, and then the date that these activities were actually completed. So when I say a forest management project is delayed, what I'm measuring is that time in days, the difference in that first activity between when it was planned to be completed and when it was actually completed. And it is a big assumption to say that because the first activity was delayed, the whole project is delayed, but that is an assumption that I'm making. So I looked at these project delays for national forests in the Western US, so regions 1 through 6. And a lot of this can be ignored, but based on some different project characteristics of forest management, there can be pretty big median delays. So luckily, a lot of projects are not delayed, but then there are a few projects that are delayed many years, and so the data is kind of skewed, but using the median delay is pretty okay. So for forest projects that require an environmental assessment, one of those NEPA analyses, the median delay is 291 days, so 7 to 8 months. For forest management projects that occur in Region 4, that median delay is 120 days. And this length of delay is what I'll be using in simulations that I'll share. So I came to a little bit of a decision point where I had to decide, well, do I want to simulate a forest management project as like a case study? So use the exact days of when activities were planned to be completed, and then use the exact same days of when they were actually completed. And instead, I chose to make my life a little harder And I used all the data that I collected on timber harvest projects in the Western US, and I used a Markov chain to create a typical timber harvest project. And if I talk about this too much, I'll take up all my time. So if anybody has questions about this later, I'll be happy to talk about it then. So then part 2 was model it. I used Joshua's vegetation management driver to model these simulations. So I had many scenarios. The only one that's not listed here is a control scenario. So I just let a forest grow and have natural, natural mortality. I didn't have fires, so I can't say natural disturbances. And then I tested out a single day selective logging. So with selective logging, only a certain fraction of trees from 10 to 50 centimeters were removed. And then I started testing my typical timber harvest that I used the Markov chain for, again, selective logging, which isn't that realistic, but to do the Markov chain, it just had to be a basic, did a harvest occur or not necessarily was it thinning or a shelter wood preparatory cut or any of the different types of cuts that the Forest Service does. So these are all selective logging simulations. So the typical timber harvest, and then using the data from project delays, I used that same timing, that sequence of activities for the typical timber harvest and delayed it 291 days. Again, for a project that required an environmental assessment, I delayed it 120 days. So for projects in Region 4, I used that typical timber harvest and repeated it every 15 years. And then I did, as another end member, a complete clear cut. And so these simulations to kind of test how timing would impact the forest, I ran these at a single point in southern Idaho. So here's the Pacific Northwest, Boise is here. I planned to parameterize it for a specific experimental forest for reasons that didn't turn out to be that helpful. But anywho, so I parameterized the 1 PFT to represent ponderosa pines. So I changed like the wood density and some of the allometric parameters. I used a 4 kilometer resolution downscaled Crew NSEP and recycled it every 25 years for the climate forcing. And thank you to Polly Biot, who helped me get this set up. I did 150 years spin up in quotes. It's not a spin up in a traditional sense as far as getting soil nutrients stabilized, but I wanted to get trees large enough to harvest, which was a problem here, and we'll talk about that later. And then so at year 150 or 151, depending on the delay of the scenarios, I harvested the trees. And so the figures moving forward start at that point. So we're only looking at time post logging. So after that first initial logging activity occurred. So I looked at some of the functional variables, and within the functional variables, I was thinking about productivity. So GPP, also NPP. I looked at evapotranspiration, even surface runoff and soil infiltration, but the story is basically the same for all of these variables. So this red line and all of the figures moving forward is the clear cut. The black line is the control scenario. The blue, yellow, and green lines are all those selective logging scenarios delayed, occurring at different times of the years. The project's delayed a little bit. The clear cut, so the most intense harvest had the biggest impact on these functional variables, but it's short-lived. It recovers within about 5 years. So on the left, these are 5-year increments looking at seasonal GPP through time. The dashed lines are plus or minus 1 standard deviation. And again, kind of a quick recovery after 5 years. Everything is pretty much nicely close to the control, but there is minor variation through time. So if you look at the annual mean GPP difference from the control, so the control is now this dashed line, plus or minus 5%. Again, the clear cut, that highest intensity harvest has the biggest impact. Here's that continuous logging scenario. So you can see at 15 and after 30 years, the impact it has on GPP. And then it kind of stabilizes. But a colleague pointed out that you do get minor variation long-term in productivity, especially between the different logging scenarios, which again are only delayed, 4 to 6 or 7 months. And you get, greater than 10% difference between these scenarios long-term. I looked at above ground biomass through time. So again, time years post-logging, and this is a 5-year moving average to help to smooth above ground biomass a little bit because it can still be a bit peaky. And as you can see here, there's still some control on the climate forcing and the cycle of the climate forcing used. Again, the clear cut, the highest intensity harvest had the biggest impact, but it also recovered back to the control level the quickest. And once all the scenarios recovered back to the control level, it pretty much stayed there and went back to, I hate to say equilibrium, but went back to kind of an equilibrium. And it recovered in about 20 years, which for ponderosa pine forest is pretty good.
Katie, you're at 12 minutes.
Okay, all right. I will wrap up quickly, very quickly. The biggest thing is the structure changes, so I'll zoom ahead. Ponderosa pine forests are not as dense as Fates ended up showing. And the biggest thing that I wanted to show is that 80 years post-logging, you can get these big deviations, especially at the peaks and valleys of these time series, based on pretty small differences as far as what the harvest scenarios were. And this red line is the mean stem density of ponderosa pines in southern Idaho that are between 10 and 30 centimeters. So have very dense forests. Fates actually captured these larger size trees pretty well. But then the largest trees, I hardly had any. So I ran into a lot of difficulties growing large trees. The big points, small changes in the timing of these selective harvests led to long-term changes in stem density and forest structure. So if that's what you're interested in, is forest structure, it may be important to include this detailed timing. But if you're more interested in the function later on, maybe this detailed timing is not necessary. So I had some limitations, but with that future work, I would like to scale up, and I would like to get my trees to grow bigger. So with that, I'll take questions.
Thanks, Katie. Questions? Maybe I see Ryan in the chat is asking about this question about the size distributions, and asking what parameters or controls were key in getting them to a reasonable size. Yes, do you want to talk about that a bit?
Yeah. So, thank you, Polly.
That's Ryan, but yeah.
Sorry. Thank you, Ryan. We're keen getting them to a reasonable maximum size. So I didn't get them to a very good size, but and actually, since I lumped that 30 to 50 together, most of that stem density was taken up by the trees from 30 to 40 centimeters in that size class. And so getting above 40 was difficult. And I, at the end, was thinking, well, did I mess up what element? Because I only changed the DBH to height. The default, and I didn't even change the lawn trees for DBH to height all that much from default. And like really all I changed was wood density and some of those allometric parameters. And I think the initial like stem density that I lowered that. So I'm really not sure, because I'm kind of stumped on how to get these trees to grow larger. So if anybody has some insight on that, that would be great.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Katie.
Any other questions, or if not, we can move to the sort of general questions about all for all three speakers this morning. Laura, I see you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I was just going to put this in the chat, but I'll just ask. I was just wondering on the spin up, whether size distribution was something that you used to determine whether your spin up had been long enough. I know you said you wanted to spin up for 150 years, and I didn't quite catch whether you met your benchmark on that, and whether, yeah, it seems like there could be an interaction between like the spin up and the parameters, and I was just curious about that.
Right. I did consider that maybe my spin up should be longer. It just took a while to get this up and running. And so by the time I could get the trees to at least 10 to 15 centimeter DBH, I was happy, because about 15 centimeter is kind of a minimum in Idaho where trees would be harvested. So I got to the point where I could get lots of those 15 centimeter trees, and I thought that was good.
Gordon?
Oh, yeah, hi. This is a question for Jackie, and it relates to parameter estimation, because that's such a big, important part of FATES. And I was wondering if you've noticed anything working across scale about changes in parameters that you needed to use. And specifically, for example, like Charlie was working at Barrow, Colorado Island, and had a parameter set for that. And then you started doing sort of basin scale simulations for the Amazon and South America, and then also moved to pan-tropical. Do you notice any differences in sort of parameters that work and don't work, in ranges that are appropriate across those scales?
It's a really good question. And so the tree parameterization that I'm using is based off an ensemble member that Charlie identified with his work at BCI. And so BCI is a moist tropical forest. There's not a lot of disturbance there. And so as one of the things that I didn't mention was one of the next steps is to go to site level validation. And so I don't expect this tropical application to be the best parameter set for a site level validation at a dry forest in Brazil. And so I have data from a multi-year burning experiment, and so I'm going to be doing site level experiments there. And so it's, but the benefit of using this general parameterization is that through the competition, the different strategies of the vulnerable tree and the tolerant tree, you do get reasonable distribution. And so it's not necessarily the best parameter set for your location that you might want to do, but it's absolutely a good starting point. And then the grass really gave me a lot of problems and continues to be a thorn in my side, but the grass is behaving reasonably. I didn't show validation results looking at carbon use efficiency and other metrics, but things are looking reasonable. But there is a difference between looking at these general large scale validations and then the site level validation.
Great, thanks, Jackie. Peter?
Thanks. It's great seeing all this land, but I guess all the fire and also the forest management coming together. I'm wondering how important is it to have like separate soil columns with the patches, especially with nutrients coming on board. Obviously, like time since a fire, and do we have a pathway for like trying to get multiple soil columns with patches working? That's to all three speakers, I guess.
Who wants to handle that?
We've definitely talked within the FATES community about transitioning to discrete soil columns. And so as you have a disturbance, then you would you would modify that soil column, and then the disturbance history would be carried through. Peter is exactly right that as it stands, when you have a disturbance, you're modifying your above ground, you're modifying your pools, but the above ground patches are on a shared below ground column. And so with fire, that's an essential component. And so the simulations that I have they would be somewhat different if we had unique soil columns. Do the logging folks want to chime in on the importance of this? Joshua, Katie?
You're bringing me back to stuff I obsessed about several years ago and I've managed to stop thinking about for a little while. Yeah, because when I was using regular CLM, that was an issue that I was thinking about a lot, and I actually thought about implementing it, but it was, I remember at some point in the discussion, the idea that fates could be instantiated multiple times per grid cell. Essentially, you'd have two separate instantiations running that would then maintain their own separate columns. I don't think that solves everything, but it allows you to potentially break out certain major types of landforms, or associate with when hill slopes are coming in. There was a talk was that each hill slope would have its own everything. So that there'd basically be a fates instantiation of that. I think that there are issues that in the fates community we're dealing with in terms of the model is dealing with patches and lots of plants that in ways it's complicated to really know in the model what they represent. They have to be able to represent distinct communities that interact very minimally and ones that are right next to each other. And I don't think we have completely figured out how to do that. I think that some of the issues we have with patches interacting is kind of a related issue that we're more familiar with. So I think there's a lot of discussion to be had. I think that having some room for separate columns, though, is important. Just in the chat, I was talking with Sam about there's going to be, I'm going to hopefully start using nutrients soon, and I'm going to use fertilizing when I do that. And I don't want to be fertilizing everything. That was the reason I wanted to add in separate patches, and it separates competition, but it separates when you start messing with the nutrients in the soil. You really need to start thinking about these things, or irrigation too.
Great, thanks. Yeah, lots to do on that front. All right, so we're now into the next time slot, which are 5-minute lightning talks. Ketil Aus, I'm almost certainly mispronouncing your last name. You are up first. Would you like to share your screen?
Okay, so do you see the full screen presentation now?
Yes.
Yeah, perfect. Okay, thank you. So I will give an update on the implementation of MOS in CTSM phase. So this is Hui's work. I simplified the title a bit because he gave a presentation last year, and now this is a 5-minute presentation. So I'll skip a lot of details. So let's see. But this has been going on for quite some time now, alongside other activities. Yeah, I should say this is Hui's work. I'm just presenting because he couldn't join today, but I'm involved in this as well, plus a lot of other people here in Norway. So we had a discussion about how do we structurally implement MOS, because you could treat it as a soil layer, which is how it's been implemented in several land models already. But if you want to capture like the effect on the carbon cycle, these kind of things, or the living part of the carbon cycle, then you might want to treat it as canopy, or be able to represent the photosynthesis and these kind of things. So. And also the discussion on whether it belongs in CTSM, adding a new PFT there is not straightforward. Fates is more adapted to that, but again, then it might not be a soil layer. So what Hui did, he's been working on this over some time and implemented it in several ways. So right now he has a version which includes all of this. Through name list options. So he has made a lot of switches and options so that you can test pure vegetation, pure soil, or some kind of merge or blend of these, and use either Fates radiation scheme or CTSM big leaf radiation, etc. So I don't intend you to read all of this, but this is just a screenshot from his name list options. So this is really fresh. So I don't have a lot of results, but I will show a few single point results using these different options. And then we did these experiments really recently. And these are first just using the bare ground and grass for comparison. And then we have one where moss is treated just as a single soil layer, having the thickness of the first soil layer in CTSM, 2 soil layers or 3 soil layers. And here the properties are just like organic matter. So it's like basically like peat. And then 2 experiments where he has blended moss as canopy and as soil layer. So this is S1, V1, which is like 1 soil layer, peat properties plus radiation and other photosynthesis and other processes is treated as canopy. And then 2 versions of this, and I won't go into the details. I don't even know them. Yeah, so these are the experiments and a few results. So first, just to check what's going on if you just add it as 2 soil layers. And that's the yellow line here, comparison with bare ground and grass. So this is actually looking okay. You do get to see the insulation effect in both summer and winter. So it's kind of behaving like you want. Adding all the other lines here, you can see that you start getting quite a big spread. And the parameters here should probably be optimized much more. So this is just, without going really into the details of all the parameters that should be tweaked for this. But just out of the box, what do you get when you have these structural differences? And you see here that these vegetation versions are the outliers in the spread. So that's where you start getting different kind of results. How am I doing on time?
I think about 20 seconds left to go.
20 seconds, okay. Then I'll skip, but just mention that we have some experiment, like measurements from colleagues who are doing these removal experiments. So that's what I don't have time to show, how this compares, but we are starting to look into that right now. So that's also ongoing work. So I'll skip those figures and just jump to the summary. So we have a functionally working version of both CTSM and with fates with multiple options. And yeah, we get the first order effects, but there's a lot that remains here, specifically the parameter tuning, but also scaling to larger scaling globally. So yeah, that's it.
Great, thank you so much, Guido. We don't have quite time now, but we have time for questions for everybody for all of the lightning talks. So up next is Marius Lambert. Marius will be talking about towards realistic plant hydraulics in the Arctic boreal zone by modeling cold acclimation. So Marius, I see your screen.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you as well.
I'm just struggling to show this. Maybe I have to do something with the display.
I think you're hovering over the correct icon. You're about to hit the present button, which looks right.
Yeah, I think it's the one in the bottom right-ish. Next to the plus minus.
Here? Yeah, okay, now it works. I don't know why. Anyway, so my name is Marius. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Oslo. And I've been working quite a bit with fates, hydro and fates in the Arctic region. And I have updated a couple of difficulties simulating vegetation growth there. So I spend my time implementing a hardening scheme into the model to predict frost mortality and improve plant hydraulics in the Arctic region. So for those who don't know what hardening is the process by which vegetation increases its tolerance to frost. So it happens during autumn when winter is arriving, when temperatures drop, when days become shorter. And vegetation then produces some antifreeze proteins which prevent intercellular freezing. And in spring, when temperatures start increasing again, we have a dehardening phase, which is crucial to enable reactivation of the metabolism. Now, in the default phase, frost mortality is triggered when a fixed temperature threshold is crossed. Here I show a couple of, or for each PFT, you have a value. So -80 would mean that that PFT is very frost tolerant, 2.5 for tropical PFTs, which would typically not grow in northern regions. But PFTs that have -80 might never experience drought at all. So we implemented this hardening scheme, and we have a frost hardening switch. If it's turned to true, then we're using a time varying hardness level to predict frost mortality. I don't have time to go into details of the scheme, how it works, but it's basically dependent on the temperature and the photo period. And here I'm showing 3 sites. The upper one is in Czech Republic, and the lower one is in Siberia. And in green, you can see the hardness level. So now it's not a fixed value anymore, but it's varying and decreasing in winter. And we can see that in the warmest site, so the top one, it's reaching only -20 in the middle of the winter, more or less. And in the coldest site, so the lower one, it can go up to -70. So I used this freeze tolerance PFT parameter to fix the range to fix the maximum hardness. So the maximum hardness, I wrote the equation here. It's the maximum between that PFT parameter and a site-dependent temperature index. And so in blue, I show the occurrences of frost mortality events. And so here, all the 3 graphs are for a PFT that is broadleaf called deciduous, which has a maximum freezing tolerance of -80. But here I only allow up to -70. So for another PFT with a max freeze tolerance of 2.5, the green line will just be flat. So we still keep this distribution, the distribution effect. But in addition, we allow for these frost events when the minimum temperature crosses the hardness level. And so this is not, we didn't stop there. We also used the hardening to do something else. So when a plant is in a hardy state, it produces antifreeze proteins. And so the ultimate effect of this is that water potentials in the plant will decrease and the xylem conductivity will decrease as well. And so in the default Fates hydro, so now it's hydro only. In Fates hydro, we have observed a lot of desiccation. As soon as the soils start to freeze in winter, water flows from the plant to the soil through the roots. And so we use the hydro hardening switch to use the hardening level, also to modify the conductivity between the tissues, to modify the conductivity between the stomatal conductivity, and to decrease hydraulic failure. We also tested changes of the pressure volume curves of the plant to try to mimic what plants will do in a hardy state.
Marius, you have 5 minutes.
Yeah, I just explained this this figure, or we skip it.
If you can, I guess the summary slide, that would be great.
Yeah, but yeah. So on the right, you see the default and the hardening, and we see that thanks to this hydro hardening thing, we're able to simulate vegetation in a site where there will maybe, or where the model won't simulate vegetation before. And this is my summary slide. It's simply these 2 switches, what they allow, and then recommendation for future research, which is comparing the frost model with observations, maybe to tune it a little bit if needed, and then 2 kind of issues that I think should be tackled. One is about high amounts of carbon starvation and sometimes termination mortality, which can swipe out 1/3 or 50% or all the vegetation. So that has something to do with the carbon storage and stuff. And the other one is infiltration rates, which are extremely high in sites where the soil is frozen during snow melt. Thanks.
Great. Thank you very much, Marius. Again, we don't have time for questions now, but if you do have questions, you can hold them until the group question and answers. So up next is Polly Biot. Polly, I don't see your video or screen. Okay, see your screen. But we do not see or hear you if you're trying to talk.
Okay, find all the right buttons.
Great.
Right, thanks. I'd like to share some work that Laura Kippers and Charlie and I are doing using fates for attribution, trying to disentangle the effects of fire and fire suppression and climate warming and CO2 concentration and management on changes in forest structure composition. So to do this, I think there's a couple things fates needs to be able to do. First is it has to really faithfully represent the ecological niches of the PFTs that we're defining. And it has to be able to spin up a realistic forest with a realistic fire regime. So those are the two main parts that I'll talk about, how we're assessing whether that's actually happening or not. So we're working in the mixed conifer forest of the Sierra Nevada mountains in California. And in this forest, there's really three really dominant controls on species composition. Those are drought tolerance, shade tolerance, and fire resistance. So we're working with 3 different PFTs, one modeled after mostly ponderosa pine, another fir, it's white fir, it's the lower of the lower elevation of the firs, and incense cedar. And you can see that they kind of separate themselves across these axes with, whether they're more drought tolerant, shade tolerant, or fire resistant. And in this forest, since what we're referring to as the pre-colonization time, the current forest compared to that time is much denser, and it has a greater proportion of incense cedar and white fir than it did before. And that's because this forest experienced a low severity surface fire regime, and that maintained a forest structure of more large trees and less dense. So to make sure that the PFTs are actually representing these niches, we're starting with large ensembles of single point runs at 2 locations, and the low end of this forest and the low elevation and the upper elevation end. And then really using this idea of the leaf economic spectrum to define plant trade-offs. And so, for example, doing a literature review, these are showing means of species that occur across this region in California. And so that we have traits correlate with each other. You can't have both a long lifespan and a really high VC max. And these red dots are just where ponderosa pine, incense cedar, and fir fall out. Then not only do we want to maintain these correlations so the PFTs fit this theoretical idea, but we also, when doing the sampling, want to preserve these trait values because the range of observations it does overlap. And so just to show this in a simple way, pine has a higher, no matter where it's sampled, it should always have a higher leaf nitrogen than fir or incense cedar. Flip that around, sorry. Yeah, pine, sorry, I'm getting confused with my figures. And this also needs to be maintained across however many PFTs you have. And so, the large ensemble, there's a lot of ways of the mechanisms of doing this, but these are just constraints that need to be included however the sampling is done. And then finally filtering these single point simulations to ensure that we're getting the correct responses to changing environmental conditions. Here's an example of just a 2 PFT simulation with fire on, there's more pine. With fire off, there's less pine relative. And again, checking that, the mortality is actually due to fire and not other things. So having done this for across 2 different single points, we now have 9 plausible parameterizations for a 3 PFT forest. And so now FATES has to be able to spin up the pre-colonization forest and fire regime. For one to say, what was the effect of changes to climate or fire, excuse me, then we have to know that it's really getting that original forest condition correctly. And so spin up is has a little, there's more to it when using FATES than just the big leaf model. So these are 5, the colors are 5 different parameterizations that have been run now for, it's actually 125 years on mislabeled axes. And from an above ground,
5 minutes.
Okay. They look good from an above ground carbon perspective, but not from a stand structure perspective. This is quadratic mean diameter. Think of it as the average tree size. It's still changing. So we need to incorporate that. So then we can then get to spin up and maybe further limit our regional parameterizations once they're run across a region by benchmarking, which I won't have time to talk about. Thanks.
Thanks, Polly. Yeah, sorry, we don't have time for questions, but we will in the next, after everybody's spoken. Up next is Adam Atchley, who's going to present on behalf of both him and Rutuja Tarak. Adam, we see your screen. But we do not hear you if you're trying to talk.
Nope, just trying to turn on all the knobs.
Great.
All right. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
All right, thanks. Thanks for having me. So I'm Adam Atchley. I'm speaking on behalf of Rutuja Tarak. She did a lot of great work for this project. I changed up the presentation to talk a little bit about what about I know. But what Rutuja has done is pulled in the FATES modeling component into our fire modeling framework. So what we are really interested in is the use of prescribed fire with the hope that it prevents ecosystem transition. So if you remember Polly's 5-minute talk, she was talking about these fire suppressed forests where they're really overstocked. And the idea is without fuels reduction, particularly through prescribed fire, they're at a high risk of high severity fire. You get ecosystem transition. The hope is that a science-driven prescribed fire framework would help stabilize that ecosystem and stabilize the carbon. Not to say that it's going to push back all the changes that these ecosystems are experiencing due to climate change, but hopefully it will harden them a little bit. So the problem, though, is that wildfire science has been focused on high severity fire and doesn't address prescribed fire conditions. And the difference here is that prescribed fires generally take place in marginal burning conditions where things like forest structural, fuel moisture, topography, and all these different toggles have outsized control and successful application of prescribed fire. And this paper by Kevin Hires does a really good job of really saying, hey, we need a new prescribed fire science regime. And the part that I'm most interested in is what are the more sensitive model applications that we should be using? So to address that, what we've been doing is working on this, what we call the mechanistic and disturbance response model. The general idea is you start off with a plant successional model like ELM FATES, and then you run these more sensitive, higher fidelity fire models to get at what the disturbance looks like, and then map that disturbance back to FATES. And then on the right here, you can see some work that Rutuja has done where we've been able to run FATES, feed fire tech, and then feed fire tech back to FATES to get at what the ecosystem would look like. Now, mapping to this fire model takes a little bit of work because it's a very different fire model than most. It's a what's called a computation CFD model, or computational fluid dynamics model. And that's because it solves Navier-Stokes in the atmosphere. And what that really does is it couples atmospheric fire weather conditions to the fire behavior itself. In order to do that, you needed to map 3D forest structure into the domain. And so to illustrate that, I have a tree on the right. You can see our little mesh there. It's a little bit complicated, but with a model like Fates, you have some tools to guess or try and get at what the 3D forest canopy would look like. So Fates provides an evolving fuel profile, and importantly, it provides species cohort density, so you can get a number of trees per cell or per area. And then it also provides species cohort age. And so for a different cohort, one cohort might be 10 meters tall, another cohort might be 5 meters tall, and you might have shrubs. Now there's still some holes we have to fill in, and that's exactly how the cohorts are spaced within the model. Are they evenly spaced within a grid cell, or are they clumped together? And to do this right now, we just assume a random distribution, but we're looking to use FIA data and data products like fast fuels to help inform that. So let's see, next slide. What do we get and why? What do we get out of the fire modeling? Well, when you're able to simulate a mechanistically disturbance or a physically based fire model, we're able to track combustion, scorch injuries to the canopy in hopefully a more detailed way. And so this is an example of that, where I can see in my little figure here, we have a tree and litter and grass, and then now we can calculate individual cells that either lost biomass due to combustion or crown scorch. And why this is important, on my last slide here, what we think we're going to get out this is a demonstration of how fire behavior and the tight coupling between the crown structure and the fire behavior itself causes tree mortality. So on the right, you see a validation heat source test where we're matching the Van Wagner crown scorch model, or that's on the left, I'm sorry. And on the right, we're using the same heat source, but we're changing the canopy structure to get a very different crown scorch height. And we think the idea is that by mapping these differences to crown scorch, we can help guide fates in a way that says, here's what a specific forest structure heterogeneity would cause in terms of tree mortality or the successful application with a fire.
Adam, you have 5 minutes. Thanks.
Perfect. I'm done.
Cool. Thank you very much, Adam. And again, there's some questions in the chat and also afterwards. So then the last of our lightning speakers is Ryan Knox. Ryan's going to be talking about the evaluation of dynamic nutrient cycling version of Fates ELM at a tropical forest testbed site. So Ryan, we can see your screen, but it's not in presentation mode right now. And we can't hear you either if you're trying to talk, or see you for that matter.
Sorry, my computer's super slow today.
No problem.
Oh my goodness.
It's okay. If you can present it the way you're showing before. It's not. I guess it's not a big deal.
Sorry, it's like every button click takes like a few seconds to. Okay, there we go.
All right,
okay,
we see it now. Yes, and we hear you.
Yeah. So my team and I, my colleagues and I, have been working on developing the nutrient modeling efforts in Fates. We've been using ELM as the host model up to this point, which is the sibling model to CLM, but there's no reason that all this effort can't be translated over to CLM, and that's our intention and our hope. I'll talk a little bit about the concepts involved in the model, some calibration, some evaluation efforts. So these are all the prognostic pools that we predict, at least for the nitrogen cycle. We also do a phosphorus cycle, but I'm just looking at the nitrogen cycle here. below ground should look very familiar to people who are familiar with things like century, relative demand, or like ECA type of approaches that are currently used in CLM and ELM. And above ground, what we're doing is we're predicting the nutrient concentrations or content of the different organs in all of our cohorts. And what makes this different in FATES than big leaf models is that in FATES, we have tons of cohorts. We can have hundreds or thousands of them all interacting in the soil. So these are the fluxes or the physics modules that translate nutrient flows from one to the other. And I dimmed out the stuff that was pre-existing in the big leaf model. And just looking here at the FATES model, a lot of these processes are pretty straightforward. Things like allocation and recruitment are pretty much based off of relative need concepts, defining a target amount of nutrient that needs to go into one of these pools, and then just looking at the relative needs of all the different organs and pushing them in proportionally. We don't do any carbon cost accounting for things like reabsorption. We just reabsorb a fraction of the nutrient, nitrogen or phosphorus, from leaves and fine roots when they turn over. What else can I say? We're working on a symbiotic fixation module. Charlie wrote up some code for that, but we haven't actually tested that. So really, a lot of the dynamicism of the model comes through this plant mineral uptake flux from the soil into the plant right now. We've tried to keep the model fairly parameter simple up to this point. I mean, FATES is a really complicated model already. And we want to have a nutrient-enabled model that doesn't just load on parameters for everybody. Of course, the key ones are, setting these parameter constants for CN and CP ratios. CN ratios are already used for not the big leaf, but the carbon-only model for respiration costs. But now these ratios dictate the construction cost of the plant. I mentioned reabsorption rates for turnover. Those are typically easy to get from the field except for the root, but the leaves are, as well as the organ concentrations. Fixation parameters. And the last two I feel are kind of difficult, might end up being actual calibration parameters, but the maximum amount of nitrogen and phosphorus storage in a plant, which seems a little bit nebulous at times. And then also the maximum uptake per fine root biomass, which we call Vmax. But I think there's hope for Vmax. It's like, if you look at that parameter, you're like, well, how in the world could we determine what is the effective uptake capacity of a plant? But you can kind of back it out through allometry. Our allometry for a plant tells us what are the nutrient proportions of the different organs. We can get field data to tell us about turnover, and we can get field data to tell us about growth increment. So with that, you can find out what is the equilibrium nitrogen maintenance rate per fine root biomass just to exist. And then you can also look at, well, what is the nitrogen rate required to actually grow? And if you combine these two, you can kind of back out a starting point for this Vmax parameter. Now I compare this to like a binary search algorithm. It actually came out pretty close. So the point I'm trying to make here is that we're trying to make this a model that's not like incredibly tedious to calibrate. Okay, a little bit more about evaluation. If you look up in the upper right-hand box here, it talks a little bit about this uptake hypothesis. And we tried to make a connection between the nitrogen or phosphorus storage in a plant relative to its carbon storage. And the idea is that if the plant is at any time, let's say nitrogen or phosphorus rich compared to carbon, then it's going to decrease the amount of fine root biomass that it has, and then vice versa. And what happens?
5 minutes.
Oh, we're at 5? Okay. So we have that hypothesis in there. This is something that we have data on in the field, at least at Barrow, Colorado Island. So it's something that we can calibrate the model on. And the other thing that this lets us do is it allows us to have some type of plasticity in the model on allocation strategy. And we're finding that understory plants have much less fine root biomass, which decreases their respiration costs compared to canopy plants. and allows them to fill a completely different niche than they did before, as this kind of bide your time type strategy instead of a rapid grower type strategy. So I'm pretty excited about that. That's it. Thanks.
Awesome. Thanks, Ryan. And since you are the last speaker in this lightning talk session, we can now open it to questions for any of the lightning speakers. Now, I haven't been able to keep track of all the comments in the chat window, so maybe I'll just, use hands. Gordon, I see you've got your hand raised.
Yeah, I want to, hey, Ryan, that was great, thanks. And this is not just for you, it's for other people too. I want to go back to a general topic we brought up yesterday about the coupling between the sort of the FATES, the parte implementation of nutrients and the below ground soil implementation. And for example, you mentioned, this work is being developed with ELM. When it's used within CLM with this different soil biogeochemistry and then even switching over to mimics, would we expect to see sort of different, calibration, would different calibrations be needed for this, to get it to work? And this is not just for you, Ryan, this is like a general thing. We were talking about it yesterday, and I'm sort of, I have a feeling that we're going to have to recalibrate everything, when parte comes into CLM. When we use the CLM biogeochemistry, and then if we switch to mimics, it'll have to be recalibrated yet again. And so I just sort of wanted to see if that's the general idea that is that right, or is this more generalized?
Well, I won't speak for other people's algorithms, but that's a great question, Gordon. Thanks. My sense is it depends on how effective the model is in its calibration phase at representing the pools that FATES directly interacts with, like ammonium and nitrate concentrations, for instance. So if our calibrations with ELM does a fairly decent job at estimating the temporal and spatial variability of those pools, then we're calibrating FATES against something that's at least reasonable. I think you're right. We can say that, but then when we actually go and do the calibrations and apply the exercise, it's not always going to be exactly as we expect. But how much different? I don't know.
Thanks, Ryan. Will, or does anybody else have a response to that before we move on?
Yeah, I guess I was gonna kind of piggyback on it.
Okay.
And it was more. So I'm guessing, and just to dig into the specifics a little bit, I'm guessing you guys are using the Berkeley. Well, maybe you've tested this some already. Like there's these two flavors of ELM already, and is from the runs that you've done at BCI, are the results very sensitive to which version of ELM you're coupling to, or have you not tried that?
We've tried both. It's coupled to both.
Okay.
We found there is a lot of sensitivity, particularly in short and medium term dynamics. In terms of like the equilibrium forest stand demographics, there weren't huge differences, although each of them has to be calibrated slightly differently.
Okay. Yeah, so it does suggest that then the size of the inorganic end pools, or the rate at which they're turning over, is an important knob.
Yeah.
Which makes sense, but okay, that's good to know.
And again, for the plant side, we can look at inventory data to get a lot of these things, or field data, which gets us pretty far.
Yeah, I guess, on the CLM side, I would argue that our representation of inorganic nitrogen dynamics is terrible now. And
that's a very hard one to get observations to compare against in the field.
Right.
So.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's easy to measure the pools, but hard to measure the fluxes. So.
Right.
Okay. Thanks.
Other questions? Or else, Peter, do you want to go through the chat and pose any of the questions that haven't been answered in the chat to any of the questioners or to any speakers?
Sure, Charlie. I mean, it seems like in the chat, most of the questions that have been posed have been answered by the speakers. Do you want to talk them through in terms of everyone else, or I can't see any questions that are kind of outstanding right now. If anyone has a question they post in the chat, they could raise their hand, that'd be great.
Jackie, I see you've got your hand up.
Well, I guess I'll just take this opportunity to invite Adam Atchley to talk about the many questions that he had in regards to, spatial scale, temporal scale, timing of FATE's integration with fire tech. Yeah. And I see that Adam answered some of these in the chat, but yeah, maybe you could just talk briefly about that. And where you're applying this and where you think it might be. Like, is it relevant to other places? Like, how portable is this?
Thanks for letting me answer these questions. I've been trying to keep up, but got behind. Let's see. So this is a CERDIP project, so they're very focused on DoD installations in the Southeast. So our primary work is in the longleaf pine stand, and it's kind of handy because they have a great prescribed fire regime and implementation there. It's probably the best place in the United States to do prescribed fire work. So we can cycle prescribed fire and ecosystem response a lot. Hopefully, I'd love to take this application into the Southwest and the Western United States. The idea is that the fire modeling itself is portable. We can use it and have used it in Southwestern settings. As you know, Polly's talk was great and described the whole spin up and setup of FATES, which is actually really complicated. And I think the more we're able to do that in different places, the better. So hopefully we'll be able to leverage some of Polly's work. The spatial scales, right now, I use 16 hectare plots as sort of the, that's my, I guess what I try to spin up on or work on all the time. We can go bigger, so fire tech can simulate larger areas, but it's at a really high computational cost. So that's on high performance computing. Well, we'll run FATES, run a fire tech simulation, pass this information back to FATES, and the limiting factor there is fire tech. The other option that we can do is the use of quick fire, which isn't technically a CFD, a computational fluid dynamics model, but it still represents the 3D canopy structure. And we're trying to get that connection between how does forest heterogeneity itself affect fire behavior into a faster running model. And that'll allow us to run ensembles and larger areas. One of the things one of the applications that I would like to go is I think what FATES is able to do is we're continually going smaller and smaller scale on these E3SM, ELM FATES scales, is that we kind of hit a crossover between the application of a model like fire tech and a model like Spitfire, because fire tech's never going to be able to run at the scales that you presented on earlier this morning, showing that global scale. So, but the bridge between, to me, actually seems to be FATES itself can kind of go back and forth between the scales. I think that answered most of the questions that were in the chat. And by the way, Rutuja's been, I was hoping Rutuja could have presented. She's done excellent work on this and has been critical at hooking up the wires between FATES and the fire models.
Great, thanks, Adam. That's all really informative.
I think because of the 5-minute time period, each of the speakers were sort of forced to wrap up early. Charlie, do we want to let some of the speakers have a little bit more to sort of finish out what they were going to present if they had the time? I think Polly was going to spend some more time in terms of how the spin-up worked and her results if she wanted to do that. Or if, Charlie, if you wanted to take the discussion in another direction, that's fine too.
I think that's fine. Yep. Polly, is there anything you wanted to wrap up with in terms of like a final point or two?
Yeah, it's actually a question. Well, so spin up, two things. Spin up really does require looking at stand structure. Just looking at above ground carbon, simulation might look like it's stable, but then the stand structure is still changing. But then a question that I have, so for an attribution study, you know, we running with constant climate, transient CO2, transient climate, constant CO2, and then with fire and with management harvest. And with CLM, we've been able to do the difference method, you know, where you don't have to run every single potential combination of those things. And I'm just wondering what people think about being able to use that difference method with fates, given all the potential for the nonlinear climate, vegetation, fire interactions. I was going to test it and see, but I just wondered if anyone had done anything like that, had any insight on the likelihood of it actually working or not.
Sorry, Polly, so was your question like looking at like benchmarking with or without a particular mechanism?
No, not benchmarking, for doing that, the actual attribution. So saying what has been the effect of warming. So running with transient climate and constant climate to see what is the effect of that driver. With CLM, you know, you can do this difference where you don't have to run with constant and transient for every driver that you're interested in, because then you can difference two simulations to get at the change in a third. But I'm just wondering if that maybe Rosie, maybe you have some ideas about this.
Are you talking about like the sort of difficulty in getting the spin up to sort of stay in a single equilibrium point and then
once you're done, say spin up's done, you're happy, and now actually doing the experiment excuse me, the experimental design for the attribution study, where spin up is finished, and now we're going to run either, you know, if it's just, so Sam, maybe if you're on, maybe you can talk about this too. We've done with big leaf CLM, transient climate and constant CO2, and transient climate and transient CO2. Each of those runs with harvest, with and without harvest. But you can imagine all of the matrix that has everything either transient or constant. And so you can get the effect of one, but if you have, you know, I'm not explaining it very well. You don't have to run every single combination, because if you have a simulation that has, you can do a difference method between them to get at the effect of, say, harvest, when you've done, whether maybe you do very harvest in a transient.
Polly, I have a quick response. I think I understand. I have a response. If I'm allowed to step out of my moderator role for a second. I mean, it seems to me that what you're getting at is very similar to actually some of the dynamics with nutrients in the big leaf model, whereby, you know, you can't really separate, or we try to separate the carbon climate and carbon concentration feedbacks, but actually there's a very large synergistic term. And I think that, you know, to me, there's an open question of how large the synergistic term is, but, you know, between climate and CO2 fertilization as regards to fire. And I actually think you probably do want to do the full matrix in order to quantify the size of that synergistic term, just as, you know, you go back to like the work that Sonkazeli did, you know, 12 years ago or whatever, to quantify that synergistic term between the nutrient effects on carbon climate and carbon concentration feedback. So I feel like that's a really open question that you'd want to look at. That's my answer. But Adriana, I see you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I agree, Charlie. I think, Polly, I think you were hinting at that. Yeah, that I think there are too many nonlinear interactions between climate, disturbance, vegetation, you know, whatever or multiple different kinds of disturbances, like we've seen, like with insect
outbreak, that the effect of just insect outbreak or just climate change alone is not just a simple addition of climate change plus insect outbreak. And I think that's, kind of similar across the board. There's these size structure implications and competition that come into effect. And especially when you have disturbances that are influencing different sizes and PFTs differently, I think you do kind of are forced to do the full matrix. Yeah,
It's
unfortunately.
really expensive.
So just going back to the chat, that's great. I think we've closed up there. Is that right? There are some questions about the cold hardening or freeze hardening for Marius, basically about the availability of it and also like its similarity to winter wheat and vernalization that happens with winter wheat. If Marius wanted to have maybe just a little bit of explanation on how available that code is and its similarity to other ways we represent cold or hardening.
Peter, your audio was breaking up. It sounded like you had the vocoder thing going on again. But I think I can repeat what you asked, which is there similarity? A question from Marius about the similarity between the hardening scheme and the vernalization process for winter wheat. Marius, do you have anything to answer on that?
I don't have much to answer because I discovered the vernalization scheme only after my implementation. I didn't look at it so much, but I don't know who implemented it, and then I'll be able to compare if I know how it's built.
Okay, thanks.
About mosses and asking about stomatal conductance and how much of a vegetation photosynthesis component is there in the moss representation as opposed to being more representing continuation of soil layers and also the questions about beetle and radiation absorption.
Yeah, Peter, your audio is still barely decipherable, but I think that was a question for Keto on the sort of photosynthesis versus the physical effects of the moss scheme. Keto, can you answer that?
Yeah, sorry, I didn't quite catch the question, and I didn't realize it was for me. So can you repeat, maybe?
I think the question was: is the moss layer doing the photosynthesis calculations as well, or just the physical processes of of insulation of the soil layers?
Yeah, so I checked this in the documentation we have started to write. So the idea is that you can switch this on and off, but it's supposed to be working with a kind of new way, as I understand it, to do the photosynthesis where you don't have the stomatal control. And also where as I remember him describing this before, that you have the effect of the amount of water that you have intercepted in the moss layer, that there is a kind of optimal amount of water below which you don't have full photosynthesis and above which you're starting to kind of mask too much of the leaves, or I don't know exactly what you call it for brown flags. So yeah, so there are stuff going on here that I don't know the details, but it's so the focus in the beginning will not be to actually capture the full BGC of this, but like start with the biophysics. But I know who is working on some of these things as well. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Ketal. All right, so we've got actually only about a minute left now before the end of the session. Maybe can I hand it over to Will, and Will, you can describe what's going to happen next?
Sure. Yeah, so we'll adjourn from this meeting and come back at 1. And folks that are interested in hearing Matt's talk about planetary metabolism, I think is in the title, can can jump on to either the YouTube page that's linked on the agenda, or you can follow the link that Elizabeth sent out this morning in the email that got you here. And there's also a link to the Zoom meeting there. So you can watch either on YouTube or on Zoom, with more interaction if you're interested through the Zoom link.
Well, there was a question for Betty, which I don't think I have time to answer now, but we should definitely come back to just now.
Oh, yep. Yeah, we should. We'll talk about that, Betty, but I think that's an open decision about how far we get with the global implementation of FATES and whether it's ready to go for CMIP 7.
Well, can I just say quickly, Betty, you have the option of using fixed biogeography, or you have the option of using a different method, which would allow you to look at shifting vegetation in response to climate change. And so these are options that you can choose. But I think Will and Dave are addressing like whether or not it would be a default.
Right. Yeah, definitely. Hopefully, it would be a feature, and whether or not it's the default, I think is TBD.
Thanks. And Joshua, to your question, yeah, the Matt's talk is going to be in a separate Zoom link, but then I believe we're going to come back to this Zoom link again in 2 hours for the afternoon session. Somebody correct me if that's wrong.
No, that's right.
But we will, I think, because this is going to be a full 2 hours between when we end this and when we restart, we're going to, I think, close this Zoom room, or at least turn off the YouTube. So cool. Thanks so much to all the speakers this morning. This is really cool. It's always really awesome to see all the various things that people are doing, and in particular with FATES. And yeah, thanks everybody. Thanks. And see you all this afternoon.